Good evening from London. It's a lovely summer's evening, and my name's David Gluckman, and I'm delighted to be here and flattered. I've never been anywhere near Argentina, so it's lovely to be here, if only virtually. Um, I have been in the drinks business since 1969, and what I'll do to introduce myself is give you a bit of background to how I got here. I was born and brought up in South Africa. And in 1961, I came to England. When I left university, I decided to go into the advertising business. And for, about 10 years, I was in a job that I never really liked. I was an account manager, which I found extremely dull and unfulfilling. But I had two experiences which really did influence my future career. The first slide, please, was working with a company called Procter & Gamble. And Procter & Gamble, I think, kept me honest. It said to me, basically, what you're doing in your career is selling soap. You're selling product. And this stopped me from having any illusions about the romance and excitement of the business. I was selling a product, and I hope that's a theme that you will see throughout this. The other major influence, slide please, was this. It was Kerrygold. And working in the agency, we were appointed by the Irish Dairy Board to transfer their butter from an anonymous commodity to a brand. And this is very exciting because it was more than selling soap, it was selling a national cause. And to see something which didn't exist transform to a brand which became one of the great successes in the 1960s and beyond was very rewarding, and I think provided the basis for my future career. Anyway, after 10 years in account management, I managed to persuade my boss in the agency where I was working that we should set up a department to help companies develop new products. He asked me if I knew anything about it, and I said, not very much, but I'm prepared to learn. And I went on this journey, and for 3 years, working with the agency, we were moderately successful, not brilliantly so. But the most important thing for me was very early on in my career, I met a client at a seminar in Italy. Slide, please. And the company was called IDV. And IDV was International Distillers and Vintners. It was quite big. It was international without being global. It had the world rights for the distribution of Smirnoff outside the US and Mexico. It had J&B whiskey, which you may be familiar with. It had Croft ports and sherries, and Gilbey's gin, which was probably the most famous brand in the portfolio. IDV, I started to work for them at the beginning of 1969, and I continued to work for them as a consultant from 1969 to 2005. That was 36 years. I was never on their payroll. I was always only a consultant. And it was an amazing experience because it gave me the opportunity to observe a company over an extended period, different levels of management, different people, different countries. I worked all over the world. And in 1997, IDV changed to become, they merged with Guinness UD, slide please, to become Guinness UDV. And then later on in that year, slide again, they became Diageo, which is now the largest drinks company in the world. And I was with them throughout this journey, right through for 36 years, which must be something of a record, I suppose. But it was a great opportunity for me. And during the time I was there, it was a great the breeding place for interesting and exciting brands. And I'll show you on the next slide some of the most famous brands that we did. Bailey's, I think you know. Sheridan, some of you may. Le Piattor was very simply, it was one of the biggest selling wine brands in the UK during the 1970s and 80s. It actually got more people into wine than had ever been before. Green Label was a very successful whiskey brand in India. J&B Jet was very successful in Korea. Purdy's was a drink that took the company for a brief spell into non-alcoholic drinks. Malibu, I think you know. Malibu, I'll tell you more about later, but it was sold to Pernod Ricard in just after the merger because of mergers and acquisitions. Malibu for £561 million, which was back in 1997. When you hear how simply it was developed, you'd be surprised. Bombay Sapphire was another brand developed in the IDV company, and that too was sold along with Dewars to Bacardi for £1.15 billion. Smirnoff Black was an interesting development. The Singleton was developed back in the 80s and is now the fourth largest selling malt whiskey in the world. Ciroc, you may well know, and Tanqueray 10, I will talk more about later. But the whole pattern of this development, there was a very strong pattern to the way IDV developed products, and I will try to unfold this as we go along. But I'll give you a couple of short case histories, I think, which I hope will be useful and interesting to you. So could we have a new slide, please? Slide? No? I need a new slide which says the brief from hell. After about 4 years working with the advertising agency, my partner and I decided to go on our own, and we set up a small consultancy in Soho in London. And the first brief that we received from the company was what we called the brief from hell, because we didn't know the client, we'd never met him. And the brief was so open as to be almost impossible to address. Slide, please. The Irish government at the time offered a 10-year tax holiday to any enterprise that was primarily aimed at bringing export income to the exchequer. So in other words, if you developed a successful brand and managed to achieve export volume, you didn't pay tax for 10 years, which is a fantastic offer. But the point was that that was the effective brief. There was nothing more than that. There were no constraints, no limitations, no parameters. We could do whatever we wanted. And the open brief for someone in my kind of business is incredibly tough to manage. And so anyway, I got together with my partner one Monday morning, about a month after we'd opened up in business for ourselves, and said, what are we going to do about this Irish brief? And during the discussion, I said, do you think there's anything in my experience of Kerrygold butter, the Irish dairy industry, which we can bring to bear on this brief? And he said, very quietly, what happens if we mix Irish whiskey and cream? And being an action man, we grabbed him by the collar and took him down to the local supermarket. And slide, please. First, we bought a bottle of Irish whiskey. Slide. Then we bought some cream. Then we bought some cream, and then we bought. And we took them back to the office, and the combination was really not very attractive. In fact, it tasted absolutely disgusting. But I think we both felt that there was something there, if only we could find it. So we went back to the supermarket, found some powdered drinking chocolate, added them to the mix, put a bit of sugar in, did a bit of tasting. There was absolutely nothing scientific about this at all, and produced a brown liquid, which looks a bit like that in the glass on the right of the picture. And it looked interesting. We had no idea what the proportions of the ingredients were, but this whole process took no more than 45 minutes. And at the end of it, we were both kind of quite enthused about what we had here. So I called up my client on the telephone and said, can I come and see you? Their offices were only a 15-minute cab ride away from where we were. So I jumped into a cab, took it to my client. And I think here's one of the magic moments of all this, that the real heroes of ideas, I think I've discovered, are not the people who have them, but the people who buy them. Here's a man working at a company. He's committing his reputation. He's committing some of his company's money to taking a decision on something which was unlike anything that had ever been produced in the drinks business. But he said, yeah, let's go ahead. I said, can we make it? He said, I don't know, but we can try. The technical people know where they have to go and what they have to achieve. He was a very impatient man, so the next thing we had to do was to consider branding. And the next slide give an idea of how brand names occur. Now, that's the one. If you look on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a restaurant, and there's a white wall and 3 windows, and that was our office. And below our office was a restaurant called Bailey's, which was just an ordinary bistro. And I think once you get an idea, it dominates your life. So everywhere you look, there are clues and there are suggestions. And I looked at Bailey's, and all I remembered was that the man we worked with back in the day on Kerrygold said, if you ever use an Irish family name to develop a brand, don't use one like mine. His name was O'Reilly. He said, typical Irish names sound whimsical, amusing. So I thought Bailey's just fitted what we were trying to do. And I called up the client and said, how about Bailey's? He said, I love it. It's wonderful. There's two very key decisions taken very quickly. The next slide is the original pack design, and I'm amazed at how successful Bailey's has become with such a crude, rustic-looking label. But that was the first label that was produced for the brand when we presented it. So we had a label, we had a product, we had a name. We did a little bit of research, focus group research, which was all very negative. Men said it was a woman's drink, and women said it reminded them of stomach medicine. But we looked at the report and we said, no, we're not going to accept those findings. They're not acceptable. We're going to take this and present it anyway. So we took it to Dublin to present to people I'd never met before. And to my surprise and delight, they bought it exactly as it was, except for the removal of one word. Instead of Irish cream chocolate liqueur, the word chocolate was removed. They felt it didn't sound particularly appropriate. The process took us about 6 months from the idea to the presentation, and most of the time was taken up in optimizing the product because it was technically quite challenging and difficult. The next slide kind of sums it all up, I think. And click again. In 2019, which are the last figures we have available, Bailey's sold 7.1 million cases. It turned over $1.7 billion. Bailey's was at the forefront of creating the cream liqueur market, which is about 60% ahead of that figure. And all this came from 45 minutes of thinking and a lot of wisdom and bravery on the part of the client. And in fact, all the clients, the people in Dublin who were the end users, they got a very good tax holiday because I think at the end of 10 years, Bailey's was selling 4 million cases. And it has generated profit for the company since 1975. So that's 46 years. It's probably the most successful brand we've developed. Anyway, that was the brief from hell. I'll now talk about something a bit different. Slide, please. At this particular time, IDV had very little interest in malt whiskies. This was the middle of the 1980s. And we looked at the malt whiskey market and they said, well, we'd like to develop a new malt, a new single malt. We have one, but it's very obscure. And looking at the figures, malt whisky at the time was 3% of total whisky consumption. And we asked the question, why do we develop a malt whisky for 3%, a whiskey for 3% of drinkers, when you can develop one to appeal to all of them? And I'll show you why the issues existed. There are 3 slides in this picture. I'll now just show you the first one. Slide, please. Malts they had difficult names. They were almost impossible for people to understand. The packaging was extremely understated, so it didn't talk to people, particularly people who were not familiar with the category. Next one, please. The other thing about malts is they look very pale and either astringent or watered down. And they were very obscure. And we wanted to make malt simpler and more accessible to the average whiskey drinker. So our strategy was, let's produce a malt for blended whiskey drinkers, something which is an easy transition from Johnnie Walker Black Label or brands like that. So we produced this malt, which is called the Singleton. Next one, please. And as you can see, it's much more accessible. It's a much more premium looking label. It's much less laid back and sophisticated. It says on the pack, mature and mellow. So it gives you some idea of what it tastes like. It has a darker, richer color, which people associate with better quality whiskies. So I think it was everything that a malt whiskey should be at that time to attract people who were drinking blended whiskies, which is a much bigger opportunity. And 30 odd years on, slide please, the Singleton is now the 4th largest selling malt whiskey in the world. And a couple of points about, and this is the latest packaging, which I think is wonderful. And what's interesting about this is that we didn't spend 1 penny on market research. We only had one name. We had one basic idea, which is the one I've explained to you. And all the decisions were taken by people who worked within the company and understood the business. I think people too often allow consumers to make decisions for them when they should be making decisions for themselves. If you're in a business for a year, you should know that business. You should understand it. You should understand the brands within it. So I'm very proud of the Singleton because it was done incredibly quickly and very decisively. The other thing which is quite interesting about that is that because it doesn't contain a distillery name, you can source it from any number of different distilleries as long as they satisfy the designation of being a single malt whiskey. So onto the, now I'm going to give you something which I think is quite interesting and might be of use to you in the future. Could we have a new slide, please? And this, okay, you're all familiar with the term Me Too. It's when things happen in your market, and this is happening particularly in the hard seltzer category these days. Me Too is copying your competitor and hopefully coming up with something slightly better. Well, we came up with something which is a little bit different from that. It was called Me One. And Me One is copying again. Then click again. But in countries he hasn't yet appeared. So what you do is you find a brand that's working incredibly well in one market where the companies are preoccupied with building the market. And that's particularly the case in the US. And you take it and you copy it in as many other countries as you can. And here are 2 examples of this, one of which is incredibly successful, the other fairly successful. Okay, slide, please. IDB's company in South Africa discovered a brand in the US in the 70s called Cocoa Reeb. It was a coconut liqueur, coconut cordial. It did reasonably well in the US market, but nothing special. But they were very excited by it. And they took it and we transformed it into, slide, into Malibu. And as I say, Malibu is now a global brand. It was bought by Pernod Ricard for 561 million. It was just based on something that someone saw in South Africa and copied. And the company copied it everywhere else in the world. Coco Reed never really left the US, I don't think. But Malibu is a major global player, and it's finding somebody's idea and preempting it elsewhere. There's another example of this too. Slide, please. Peachtree in the US in the 80s was one of the fastest growing brands in the whole market. I think it hit 2 million cases in about 3 years, which is a phenomenal success. And I think we applied the same principle here by developing a brand called Archers, which had the same outstanding peach flavor. But we set it up in a whole lot of markets other than the US. So while Peachtree were concentrating on building their US business, we were in places like South Africa and Australia and Europe and the UK. And One is very interesting in a market like yours because it's a way of, if you look around the world at what's happening, you can take on ideas that you see happening elsewhere, bring them into your market, and run them. And I think it worked pretty well with us and may well do again. Okay, next slide. This is my last product slide, really, and it's something which I owe to my time on Procter & Gamble. It's never forget that you're selling products, not emotional experiences. And make sure your new brand offers a real advantage over its competitors. I've always felt and always tried to look for a unique point of difference for products, even in tough categories like vodka. And here are 3 examples of this, which I'm particularly proud of. Okay, slide, please. In the 1990s, Absolut set a new standard in the vodka category in the US market by producing a premium level, which we had Smirnoff, which was very much a supermarket vodka by that time. The company was obsessed with volume. And somebody came to us and said, well, can you produce a Smirnoff brand that will compete with Absolut? And that was a really tough request, really, because Smirnoff it was a bit like trying to get a Michelin star for a Kentucky Fried Chicken outlet. To transform Smirnoff into a premium was extremely difficult. And I think the theory we developed was that we would make Smirnoff into a better vodka product than Absolut. And we have the slide, please. Excuse me. So we produced the world's smoothest vodka. It was a new value in the category. And in blind tastings against Absolut, Smirnoff Black was preferred because it tasted smoother. We were offering the consumer a difference against the competitor, which they could taste. And you could, to this day, I think, if you put the two together, Smirnoff Black is a much smoother tasting vodka. It's interesting that Smirnoff was never as successful as it might have been, but for a lot of reasons. But it's interesting to note that the biggest selling brand, spirit brand in the US market now, is based on the fact that it's smoother than any other vodka. Okay, the next challenge we had. The CEO of the company, when Bombay Sapphire left, said, we have to produce a brand to operate in the same space as Bombay Sapphire. What can you do? And you need to do it very quickly. And the company owned the Tanqueray brand, and we produced Tanqueray 10. And slide, please. And what makes Tanqueray 10 different is it was the first vodka made with it should have been gin. The first gin made with fresh botanicals. And the benefit to consumers was a fresher, cleaner tasting gin. And that was a very important part of the sale for this brand to consumers. Okay, and the last one of the three was Grey Goose. Grey Goose pioneered an ultra premium category level in the vodka market. And you're always challenged with vodka. How can you come up with something different when the product has to be neutral in taste, neutral in color, and neutral in aroma? Well, what we did was we produced Ciroc, and what Ciroc's point of difference was, slide, please, was that it was unique. It was the world's first vodka made from grapes, not grain. And I think those are three examples of which I'm extraordinarily proud, because I took difficult categories with strong legislation to govern them and produced products that were different, and they weren't just flavors. They had intrinsic differences, which it made them competitive. And for that, I thank P&G, because I think they helped me with that kind of view. Anyway, this is now to sum up, and these slides are one by one, so could you do them one by one, please? What worked? They should be, okay. I'll take it the way it is. What worked, and this is not some kind of hypothetical ideal that I would like to happen. This is an analysis of what actually happened, working for 36 years with a massive company. Firstly, all the successful work that we did was managed by the top people in the company, the CEOs, often board directors. It was never generated via middle management. And I think that's a very important point. I think middle management has the problem of being afraid of failure. I think top management knows that you will fail. And I think that was important. So all the successful brands that I've shown you there were authorized by top management, not middle management. The next point, after Bailey's, everything we did, and this is incredibly important, it was based on the presentation of one single idea. We never went to the company and said, here are 6 concepts, we're going to use research to decide which is the best. We took the view that we understood the business, that our clients understood the business, therefore they should be able to cope with a single idea. And this is quite radical, but I think it's the only, to me, it's the only game in town. It's the only way that works. The next point is, I don't think you need big teams to manage the development of ideas within a corporation. In fact, the smaller the team, the more effective. The problem with ideas in many cases is that the more people you get engaged with them, the less likely they are to be successful, the less likely they are to be pure. If you think of Bailey's ended up almost exactly where we started, the management, a change of one word perhaps. It's trying to sum up my own contribution, I suppose, over the years. I think mine was a copywriter's perspective. I would write the advertisement and then go back to the technical people and say, can you make this? With Smirnoff Black, for example, my idea was for a smoother vodka. I then went back to the technical people and said, okay, can you produce a smoother vodka? And they did. And I think that's very important. Another thing that bothers me about the business, I think, is that there is too much process discussed in brands. How often do you read about craft beers or handcrafted wines or batch distilled spirits? Those things are all nonsense. They're a complete waste of time and a waste of companies' effort. What people are looking for are benefits: a smoother vodka, a fresher, cleaner tasting gin, and things like that, not processes. If you tell people something is distilled 5 times, I don't think they're in the slightest bit interested in that. And people waste time and money using things like that. Okay, next, please. Uh, the other thing is, I think that there was always been that's enough. Stop. There's been a mantra about asking consumers. You give consumers six different things, and you say to them, "Which do you like?" But I think I don't think we should ask consumers. I think we should tell them. In other words, the definition of researching a brand is you take an idea and you optimize it. You don't select one idea from a group of ideas. I think that's crazy. It's a complete and utter waste of money and a waste of time. I think you have to recognize as a company that you will fail, and we did on several occasions. But if you're going to fail, make it quick and don't spend too much money failing. I can think of some companies that spend millions of dollars before they put a brand onto the market and it fails. Now, that's not quick and that's not cheap. And that's what I would advise. Next, please. Uh, I would say halve your market research budget and then halve it again. We hardly did any research on any of the brands that I developed. They may have been researched extensively after they left our care. But I think the most research I ever did on any brand was 4 focus groups. Um, and I found, and the other thing about research, I think, is that people should do their own research. It's incredibly expensive to do focus groups nowadays. And I must have done 500 focus groups on all the brands that I worked on because it was easier to do it that way and it was a lot less expensive. Okay, next, please. I think when you set up teams to develop new brands, make sure that the people that you put into these teams have different skill sets. I always worked incredibly well with R&D people because I couldn't do what they did and they couldn't do what I did. So we admired each other for our own particular skills, and the results are there to see. And my final point, I think, is Floriat emptor. Celebrate the buyer. I think that I've probably met half a dozen people in all my time in this business who were great at buying ideas, who understood the business and understood the problems and opportunities that revolutionary ideas presented. So I think people should look for people within companies who are good at buying ideas and put them into a position where they can do that. So that is basically my story. Just can I have a slide, please? I wrote a book about my career, which was called That Shit Will Never Sell. And it's quite an amusing story to this. It was going back to 1975 when the CEO of the company took a bottle of Bailey's to our man in New York. He was a very senior man in the industry. He took one look at the bottle. He sniffed at the glass, tasted it, and said, "That shit will never sell." Well, I thought it was a great title for a book. And if anyone was interested, they could look at my website, which is www.thatshitwillneversell.com. And if anybody buys the book and would like to talk and get any advice that I might be able to offer them, they are more than welcome to contact me at that address down there. I'll just leave you with one other point, is that I asked for a summary of my talk to be produced both in English and Spanish. And if you'd like the opportunity to get hold of those, please ask the organizers of the conference. But thank you all very much for listening. I know it's been a very long conference and I hope a very successful one. But it's been great to be here with you all. And if you have any questions, please go ahead. Thank you very much. Oh, there's a question here saying, am I still working in the field as a consultant? Yes, I am. If anybody would like any work done, I'm very happy to do that. I suppose the biggest challenge in my career was staying in it and keeping doing what I was doing, staying with the same company. The biggest learning, I think, all the learnings that I've given you there were important. The fact that top people should work, should manage ideas and innovation. The fact that aiming for a better product is so important. Those are pretty key. Any other questions that I could do? I hope I've answered those questions. What is the biggest learning in your career? Going for product differentiation, the biggest challenge was staying in a job, staying to working with the same company. I think that we've come to the end of it. So thank you all very much for listening. It's been delightful to be in Argentina. Good night.